Kristen, my co-pres, I'm going to go ahead and let you get started. We're recording now.
Okay. The signage is not on anymore. Did you know that?
Correct. I stopped sharing. Yeah.
Okay, you're on the screen.
Yeah.
Okay. Good evening. Welcome to those of you watching from home tonight, and welcome to our panelists. My name is Kristen Malone, and I'm co-president of League of Women Voters of Glen Ellyn, along with Erica Nelson. Thank you for joining us for this very timely February community meeting, Local Elections and You, Fighting Voter Apathy. We have a very important local election coming up Tuesday, April 6th. So tonight we will be hearing from three panelists. Connie Mixon, PhD professor, political science at Elmhurst University. Patrick Watson, political action chair and consultant, DuPage chapter NAACP. And Retha Owen, field services director with the Illinois Association of School Boards, IASB. So welcome to everyone. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization. We encourage the informed and active participation of citizens in government. The League works to increase the understanding of major public policy issues and influences public policy through education and advocacy. So we have a few announcements to make tonight before we begin this program. Our next community meeting will be Thursday, March 18th at 7 o'clock. It will be virtual. The program will focus on environmental justice and feature a panel of 3 speakers. In addition to that, we have 3 candidate forums scheduled in March on the first 3 Saturdays of March 6th, 13th, and the 20th. All of our programs will be virtual, so please check our website, lwvge.org, for details. And thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Our moderator tonight is Karen Daly. Karen's our Vice President of Communications. So Karen, thank you so much for moderating this evening.
Absolutely. Are you kicking it off to me?
Yes.
Great. Welcome everybody, and welcome to our panelists. This is a community conversation is how we probably should be billing it. We like to bring in people who are subject matter experts and have a nice casual discussion. So I'm excited about the 3 panelists we have, and I should say I'm excited about the topic too. We're being excited about apathy, is maybe an oxymoron, but it always has bothered me how few people turn out to vote in off-year elections. And, I wouldn't miss it. I often bring my daughter in, and, I don't miss voting, even if, sometimes it's for a small office that might not seem to have a lot of impact. And I did pull some stats for us. So nationally, 27% of eligible voters vote in the typical municipal election. The most challenging one is the one in the off year after the presidential election. But for DuPage County, last time we had an off-year election after the presidential election, 2017, less than 15%, that's 1/5 of voters in DuPage County actually showed up at the polls. And these are races and election that decide and have a big impact on everybody every day, every citizen, from your school board to your your village president or mayor, however your village is organized, to your library board and your park district, things that impact you on a day-to-day basis. Local officials across the country manage $2 trillion, which amounts to about half of what is collected for taxes. So not only do they impact you day to day, they're actually spending your money. So it really doesn't make sense to me that people aren't more involved in the process. So that is the question of the day. Why, despite the fact that the stakes are so high, why do people not bother to show up? And so between the 3 of our panelists, we figured we could maybe find a working answer or a couple of good guesses maybe, and try to figure out maybe what we can do about it. I will ask a few questions and we'll take turns answering them. And then towards the end, I'm hoping that there'll be some time for people to ask a few questions. So you'll see on the bottom of your screen, there's a question function, right? Is that what it's called? I always get that confused with chat. Yeah. So you can put in your question there, and then we'll have a look towards the end of our evening.
That's
to-
correct, Karen. It's
Yeah.
the Q&A button.
It's the Q&A button. The chat, I believe, is stopped at this stage. But so let's start with the basics. Local elections, which are generally nonpartisan. We should say here in this area, most of the elections are considered nonpartisan, the exception of our township elections, which do have a Democratic and a Republican slate of candidates, but most of them are generally nonpartisan, and are about seating township and village officials, as well as boards, school boards, libraries, parks. Given these specific roles, how do you see the dynamics of local elections differing from state or national elections? So what key issues drive, I guess, the lack of attendance or lack of voter interest in these local elections versus the national ones? And I'll start with Connie, Dr. Mixon.
Great. Thanks so much for having me. I think it's important for context to realize that in the US, we have over 500,000 elected officials, but we only have one national government and 50 state governments. We have almost 90,000 units of local government. And most of our elected officials are not elected on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November on even numbered years, as we've talked about, that they're off cycle elections. Close to 80% of American cities hold their elections on days that don't coincide with presidential or congressional elections. So that has a big role in turnout. Also, in the context of Illinois, Illinois has more units of local government than any other state in the nation. For comparison, we've got 7,000 units of local government in Illinois. Think about Texas, geographical size, population. They only have 5,100. California only has 4,400 units. And, you know, in a typical suburban community, as you pointed out, there's a township, there's a county, there's a city, there's a school district, there's a community college district, there's a forest preserve district, a park district, a water reclamation district. All of these different levels of local government makes it confusing, and it's difficult to keep track of what all of our local units of government are doing. And when government is this complex, it's really difficult for students to actively participate. And so I think that's one factor. I can talk more. I don't want to keep going, but I could talk about nonpartisan elections, the role they play, but I think we're going to get to that as well. But importantly, for context, just so many units of local government make it really complicated for people to participate.
Well, one of the units is school boards, which tend to, on some years, have quite a lot of interest. Retha, would you like to comment?
Oh, you bet, you bet. Now, one thing that we need to think about is local elections really have a greater impact on the daily life of the community. When we think about just our school districts, we have 852 school districts in our state, times 7 board members. So just, Connie, I was thinking of your numbers that you're having, and each district is unique to its community. Every community has its own driving factors. It depends on what is going on as far as in the community, as far as expectations and aspirations for the education of the students, and what does the community need to prosper. And in election years, if there's a hot topic, we can get a pretty good turnout. You know, like if there's a referendum, or if they're going to sell bonds, or you know, even with the current COVID issues, we've stirred up a lot of things. But you know, sometimes when it's kind of a quiet year, we don't see that kind of urge to go to the polls, and so we need to change that. And so I really think that there is more of an impact in local elections than our state and national elections.
Sure. Would you like to weigh in on this sort of general lack of apathy, and why versus general elections versus local elections?
Absolutely. A lot of it is people are very confused with local elections. They don't necessarily know what those specific roles are of those government bodies, and it's difficult to find information about candidates that are running in local elections. And when people are confused about who candidates are or what they stand for, they tend not to vote because they don't want to make the wrong decisions. And it's oftentimes made very difficult to find information about local candidates. Sometimes races are uncontested. And when races are uncontested, people don't show up to vote. Races that people tend to show up for, as was just mentioned, are school board races. People tend to have more vested interest in school board, and they understand to a degree what the school board does. It's difficult for people to understand what a township does, for example, what a highway commissioner or another office, what those particular offices do. They do understand what school boards do, and that's one of the ways that turnout is driven. Also, these races are nonpartisan, so you don't have very well-established partisan organizations that are working to drive turnout. And that's something that we see in a lot of the other elections. And I know we're going to get to that a little bit later on.
That's true. So we're looking at, we've seen that it's complex in terms of how it's all organized and what role each of those entities play. I think that is a big role. All of you mentioned that. There are sometimes not kind of hot issues that mobilize people to go, and hot issues can also be ginned up by either side of the party. And then we're just seeing sometimes a lack of interest or knowledge of, particularly uncontested or some of these, district boards or park district and library boards and things like that. So those are all some general reasons why voter turnout is lower. Are there any others that anyone else would like to offer at this stage?
I think it's worth repeating the point that Patrick made about the importance of contested elections. And I don't know the exact number. I knew it at one point and then I've forgotten what it is, but it's like well over half in DuPage are uncontested elections where you only have one person running. So, this feeds into this idea where people, they say, well, what difference does it make? My vote doesn't matter anyway. There's only one person running. They're going to win. So when people believe that their vote won't make a difference, they're unlikely to cast a ballot. So I think one of the key things that we can do if we're thinking, further along tonight about solutions is to encourage people to run for something.
Absolutely. And if I can put in a little plug also for the League of Women Voters, one of the things that the League is probably most known for are candidate forums. And we have quite a few, most of our races this year are contested. So we are holding candidate forums, or we're offering some other solution like a video offering on our website. But the ones that are not, we're not having a conversation with these folks, and that does drive the lack of knowledge of what's going on. So agreed. So I'm keeping notes here in terms of some solutions that might pop up, so we can revisit them at the end. The second question I have is, again, looking at what our turnout was. DuPage County turnout in the 2020 election broke all records. There was a lot of general interest, but 86% again stayed home on election day when we look at municipal elections. So what do you see of the impact of people staying home? What sorts of things happen when voters stay home in the polls? And we'll start with Patrick this time.
People stay home and they tend not to vote. You may have people that don't represent their values that are elected to office. You may have a group of people that have been in office for a very long time or uncontested that don't necessarily feel as though they have to listen to constituents that are in office. They don't have to listen to constituent concerns. I would say beyond just them not voting, it's also people showing up for a lot of municipal meetings and hearing what is being said at a lot of these municipal meetings. Turnout is typically low at village board meetings. It's typically low at these township meetings. So people don't quite understand what's happening within these forms of government, and they don't hear from constituents.
Retha, what are your thoughts?
Motivated and informed citizens, they always participate, whenever election occurs. Apathy happens when people really don't understand the impact of the local elections. We heard the old saying, if you don't take time to vote, you don't have the right to complain about those that are in office. And elections have consequences. So low turnout often happens, again, if there isn't something that's motivating them to get out there and vote. But you've got people that are elected for 2 years, 4-year terms, and look what can happen in 2 and 4 years. Look at just what happened in the last year. And if we aren't paying attention to what the needs are of the community or of the school district, when something as a challenge hits that community or that school district, we may not have the right people in the position there to handle that job. And so it goes back to Patrick, what you're saying is people really understanding what is their role, how do they impact, and how do they need to work together. When we look at any type of a board, I see them as a team. And they need to be working together, for the common good. In education, it's all students. In the community, it's for the good of the many. So really trying to motivate and keep them informed, but also understand how important those roles are in that community or that district being successful.
And I think it's interesting too, from a school board perspective, a lot of school board candidates, it's the first time ever running for an office. They might have attended a few school board meetings, but maybe they don't know all the things they're getting into. They have a variety of backgrounds that maybe aren't necessarily the typical you'd find in politicians. And so that also must have an impact too, in terms of how they approach even sort of garnering attention for their races.
It makes a huge impact on school boards because they have no idea of what they're getting themselves into. Then when they get themselves into it, it's like, I don't know if I like this or not. And I think that can happen with any type of election. But I think we have got to get the information out there. We need to inform them as far as what is it that they're committed to, because it is. And they don't get paid. So they're volunteering. And I really, for those that are in education this year and board members and what they've gone through, they've earned that big paycheck of $0. So that's another reason I think in the other part of the state, you're seeing up north, you've got all these people that are running. Down south, it's the opposite. Nobody wants that job. So how do we fill those voids? So it's again, education about they're important, educating of we need people to be servants, they're servant leaders is what they are. And how do we really try to motivate those that are willing and able, but just need to be kind of pushed a little bit to encourage them to participate.
Well, we're excited that we have such a wide variety of candidates this year for our school board. And then moving back to the impact question in terms of what is the impact of low voter turnout. Connie, would you like to offer your view on that?
Yeah, as others have pointed out, when there's low voter turnout, the votes represent overall just a small sample of the population. And this is critically important because then elected officials are not truly representative of the citizens they serve. They tend to be less representative in terms of income, age, race, ethnicity of the community. We know from data that affluent voters have 30 to 50% higher voter turnout in local elections than low income voters. Those who are 65 and older are 7 times more likely to vote in local elections than voters 18 to 34. The median age of local voters is in the 60s, and whites disproportionately vote at rates as high as 20% in local elections. And one of the things that I always tell my students is that rich old white people vote, and they tend to elect rich old white people, and we tend to get rich old white people public policy. And so the overall impact is that our elected officials, our public policy is influenced by affluent white older voters, and this undermines the whole premise of a representative democracy.
Let's dig into that for a minute, because I think that's interesting. And I saw some of the same stats. DuPage County is wealthy compared to many other counties in Illinois. It's also more educated, yet we have one of the worst turnouts for these sorts of elections. So that's interesting to me. But the notion that rich old white people vote is definitely the case when you look at DuPage's stats. What other impact does having either kind of one issue voters or such a small demographic have on how things are governed. And maybe I'll turn over to Patrick for a viewpoint on that.
Sure. So just as was mentioned, wealthier, more affluent, older voters tend to vote more, and taxes tend to be one of the big issues that drives them. It's a interest, obviously, that they have. And those that are younger, minority populations, people that may be busy in their day-to-day lives. So people that either have young children, or they're working multiple jobs, or they're working a very busy job within their career, they don't have time to research a lot of these candidates. They don't know what's happening with many of these candidates. You'll find that many people don't know that there even are local elections. If you talk to voters now, they'll say, we just had an election. They didn't know that there was an election coming up. And a lot of that has to do with just the time commitment and how difficult it is to find information about candidates. Even myself, and I'm someone that's fairly well plugged in, I have a difficult time finding some information about candidates at this point. And a lot of that has dealt with the demise of local papers. There aren't quite as much reporting from local papers, local media sources, whatever, which are getting the information out. And it's one thing that I have to commend the League of Women Voters on for having these candidate forums, is it's one of the major outlets for people to get information about candidates. So the more that we can get the information out on these candidate forums and information about candidates, I think the more people will participate when they know who the candidates are.
Mm-hmm. I think one outcropping of that is sort of these one issue candidates. Maybe it's taxes or other things that can mobilize, because there's such a low voter turnout just in terms of making the numbers happen. And I think this happens a lot with school boards, sometimes against a particular person or on a particular issue like COVID-19 and returning to school. Retha, do you have a perspective on sort of community activists and maybe driving some changes that are not necessarily popular with the whole community, but because they were able to mobilize their forces, they're able to get their people in, so to speak?
Right. I understand the concept of a one issue being a motivator, but I really hope that we don't have candidates that were running on a single issue, because the job, either at a school board or even at a municipality, that's the tip of the iceberg of all the work that they need to do together. So if it's a motivator, that's great. But I think we also need to take some time. And this is where we need to either, again, as Patrick said, organizations like this and getting the word out, but also educating on what is the issue, what's going on, what are possible remedies. And with school boards, there's so much that is done that the community doesn't understand in the background of decision makings. So, being able, there's no way that one board member can be elected and feel like I'm going to fix this problem. They run as an individual when they're a candidate, and then they join a team. And we see more and more of the one issue being created in Facebook and social media. And after a while, they don't even know what they're fighting for. They're all stirred up. So, again, you can use that, but you've got to be able to, look at the big picture, look at the overall initiative that's out there, the work that is going on. And we talk about candidates, and we talk about, even joining a library or any other board. I always see that the example I use is you've got, around here I have Interstate 74. Interstate, they're going speed limit of 70 miles an hour. You got you have new members coming on. That traffic doesn't stop. So how do we get the new candidate and the new elected person up to speed so you can keep moving forward as a team? So, I really hope that they, as candidates, they take the time to educate themselves to figure out what are they getting themselves into, and understand what's currently going on, whether it's talking with the superintendent, talking with the board president, going to board meetings. There's a lot of things that they can do to kind of get a grasp of where they're going to be coming in and joining this team. So I hope that one issue is not the only motivator. I really hope that they're looking at how can I be a leader in this and moving our district forward or our community forward.
Well, and it ends up just being the tip of the iceberg of the whole governance that they're responsible for. So they're going to get themselves in a little bit of hot water on that front if that's all they're focused on. So impact, did we cover that impact of having smaller voting pools? Any other impact that we should mention here?
I think Connie hit it when she
Mhm.
said that impact is you don't have a equal representation. You don't have the whole community represented. You've got pockets of the elderly, the upper class, and we don't have the voice of the whole community in making that decision. So I think that's kind of the impact
Mhm.
and that we need to really address.
Mhm.
And thinking about DuPage, poverty is rising fastest in DuPage. When we look throughout the metropolitan region of Chicago and look at, what we call collar counties, poverty is increasing at the greatest rate in DuPage. There's still more poor people in Cook County, for example, but it's rising at the fastest rate in DuPage. DuPage is changing dramatically. And so that's certainly something, and the demographics of DuPage are changing dramatically. So that's something that we need to think about as having repercussions from low
Right.
voter turnout.
Well, it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way that the disenfranchisement, they don't have a voice, they don't feel like they have a voice, so they don't bother to vote.
Yeah, right. I mean, we could further have a discussion about structural obstacles
Yeah.
that unfortunately impact marginalized communities and people of color as well. So there's a lot to unpack within all of this that we could probably have, entire seminars. I teach entire classes on some aspects of this, but yes.
Well, we may want to do a follow-up on that for sure, because it's a topic of hot interest for the League of Women Voters in terms of having appropriate voter access. So one of the questions that I had put forward to you guys ahead of time was about accountability, and I think it's an important aspect of voting, particularly for incumbents, because basically, if you're an incumbent and you're running, it's a referendum on how you've been doing, and it's one of the key ways we keep local officials and national officials accountable. But when we look at disinterest, how are we evaluating people who run for local offices? Beyond the candidate forums that we put together, what sorts of things are we looking at from a library board trustee or a school board member or a village trustee to hold them accountable? What kind of measurement should voters be looking at, and what sorts of ways should we be evaluating them? Patrick, do you want to jump in on that one?
So looking at voting records, looking at things that they voted on, difficult decisions that they voted on, if it's a city council, looking at economic development, if it's a library board, looking at services that are available, a park district, looking at the services that are available within that park district, township, what services are townships providing, what services are the highway commission, what are they providing to those unincorporated roads that they manage, looking at food pantries within townships, how are they handling those particular services? So evaluating them on services that are available and on their voting records overall.
Mm-hmm. Rita, any view on that?
I think it's important to really look into new candidates and incumbents. It's a little bit easier for incumbents because, Patrick, you kind of covered the list of things that they can be looking at to get educated on, whether they're engaged, whether they're committed, what their vote has been, looking at meeting minutes. There's a lot of information for the incumbents, and I think the questions for the candidates would be looking at what is their philosophy, what does governance mean to them, what is that style, what does their governance style, and how does policy relate to the work that they're doing, because there's policies in any type of board and organization. So I think part of it is, again, is what I was saying earlier, is helping the candidates to understand what do they need to be successful as far as that knowledge base, and for the incumbents, it's a little bit easier. And this, I think, is something that they would have to do a little work at digging. Whether they're the district is a little bit easier because they can just go to the website and they look at they can look at that information. But for others, it can be more of a challenge to do a little bit more research. And Patrick, as you said, you have to make a commitment of time. You have to be motivated to do that. So I think that's a little challenge when you're trying to hold them accountable.
Connie, do you think though that voters feel that that's their job, is holding people accountable? I mean, at the end of the day?
Not necessarily. Citizenship in the United States has become very transactional in that we pay our taxes and we expect services in return. And we don't think about the fact that with citizenship comes responsibility. It means so much more than just voting. It means being educated. And ultimately, and I think this question I think is really important because accountability is at the core of our democracy. It's based on elected officials working on behalf of the people, their constituents. And Patrick and Retha both touched on this. Oftentimes there's a lack of transparency. It's tough. You know, Patrick pointed this out. I'm a political scientist with every research tool available to me that could be possible. And I still have trouble because there is a lack of transparency. So those are larger questions that citizens need to ask. And, you know, ultimately we have a lot to be grateful for from organizations like the League of Women Voters, a free press that helps citizens become informed. And this work is critical to preserving our democracy. You're giving citizens the tools they need. My wish was that more citizens would take advantage of it.
Yeah. And Connie, on that thought, and I hear this with boards, it's like, we got to get that person, that's just not the right person. And there's like, you voted that person in. So accountability, I mean, you can't just fire someone off of a board. There's not much that you can do. It's up to the community to really hold them accountable, and don't vote them back in if you're not happy with them. But again, if there's no transparency, how can they hold them accountable? So it's a tough one.
Patrick?
Let's touch a little bit on the transparency issue. And I think a lot of it is...
This is Patrick, sorry to interrupt. This is Erica. I've had a couple of requests for you to just increase your volume a little bit.
Sure, absolutely. Can
you
hear me better now?
Yes, we can.
Great. I want to hit a little bit on the transparency issue. I think that's a big key, and I think a lot of that is by design. It favors incumbents if people are not able to find out information about current incumbents' voting records, or even if we look at when candidates are deciding to run for office, making sure information on deadlines and when packets are available. Oftentimes this is hidden because incumbents want to make it difficult for other individuals to run or for people to find out about how they voted on specific things.
Interesting. I'm going to ask just a follow-up here that's maybe selfish for League of Women Voters, but we're about to embark on a whole lot of campaign or candidate forums, and we are asking the public for questions. But what are some, I mean, you've mentioned a few and I've grabbed them, but what are some questions with regard to this accountability issue that you would like to see asked at these sorts of forums, or that we should sort of hold people's feet to the fire on? Sorry, Connie, would you like to start?
Sure. I mean, part of it is providing the tools that citizens need. So if they're looking for votes and legislative records, where do they find those? The League is critical, right, in helping citizens access their government. Looking at things like excessive signatures to get on a ballot if you do want to run for office. Also, when people are kicked off ballots because of arcane rules about signature requirements, like making those things available so that people fully understand, I think is critical. And also just informed dialogue about the role of government, particularly local government, and the impact it has on our lives. When you were doing the intro today, I was excited to hear that you're going to talk about environmental justice issues. I mean, it's so important to a community to engage beyond us just talking about elections or political analysis kind of stuff, the things that really impact their daily lives. So thank you for that work. I mean, there's so many questions. like where to start, but the transparency part is critical.
It's critical.
Accessing the ballot, freedom of information. We could come up with lists, but that's really critical work.
Great. Anybody else, Retha or Patrick, want to weigh in on any specific questions we should be holding their feet to the fire on?
You know, I think one of it is always what's their motivation for running, because and knowing that there isn't, you know, a conflict of interest, understanding that, you know, the importance of policy and legal compliance. You know, sometimes they forget, oh, there's legal stuff that we have to do. It's like, yeah, there's a lot of legal stuff you have to do. You need to be compliant with that. And really thinking about the commitment, you know, the time and the energy that goes into this work. Are they fully committed into, you know, putting in, you know, hours of meetings and focusing and being able to think beyond oneself, to think about others and not, you know, and be able to actively listen to different viewpoints and make good decisions on behalf of the students and the community itself, you know. So I think part of it is what's motivating you, you know, and making sure that your personal interest doesn't hinder the focus of the big picture. And I'm kind of like Connie, I have a whole list of questions too.
Yeah. Well, we may be hitting you up for those. We'll have the voter services team put you on speed dial.
Okay.
Patrick, any other thoughts there?
I just want to echo exactly what Retha mentioned. It's really finding out what motivates potential candidates and making sure they understand the duties of that specific office. Things are so partisan right now that you have many people that are running on either one issue or running on partisan things that don't understand government or what specific government bodies do. So just making sure that they understand what are their responsibilities within that specific office.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you for the deep dive into accountability, because I think it's something that we don't think about as often as we need to. So now, as we had, and this is a great segue. So thank you, Patrick, in terms of talking about partisanship. You know, as I mentioned, the league is nonpartisan. Most of these local elections are, in principle, nonpartisan. But it seems, as we can all see about how divided the country is, that it's a bigger, and the identity that you have with your party is a big driver now of your personal identity. And so, you know, there's a saying that goes with regard to local election: there's no Republican way to pave a street and no Democrat way to lay a sewer. But do elections really pass the sniff test of being nonpartisan? And what are the sort of partisan aspects of how we approach local elections? And Retha, from a school board perspective, those are very generally nonpartisan, but do you see the impact of sort of the partisan nature of this country impacting even school board races?
I do, even in just this last year with the pandemic. And unfortunately, I have seen superintendents quit. I've seen board members quit because partisan has divided them so badly that it had a terrible impact on that district. And sadly, politics and partisan seem to creep into every aspect of our life. And I just want to make a plea that we must be nonpartisan. Educating our kids is not political, and it should never come to play with the work of the board. Issues of education and maintaining that really good governance and solid policy depends on that board and the admin team working together. And that focus can never pivot on those partisan politics. I mean, it muddies the focus, the purpose, and it impacts a negative impact on the academic system itself. And I work with boards, and I've had board members say, well, there's not enough politics in board work. I said, please don't bring the politics then. And I think it's something that we're going to have to try to stay committed to this being nonpartisan, so that when that comes into a meeting, someone's got to have either norms or their procedures that say, you know what, here's this is not how we're doing business. And I think we're going to have to discipline the team to recognize when they're starting to go down that rabbit hole and come back, whether that's the board president or the chair or whoever's part of that team, it's like, that's not what we're doing here. We need to focus on, whether it's your goals or your mission, your vision. And this is going to just continue to be a challenge if we don't try to discipline ourselves and stay nonpartisan. So that's my plea.
Yeah, it is a challenge. It is a challenge because it becomes a feedback loop that is never ending on that front. Patrick, would you like to weigh in this partisan discussion of local elections?
I want to echo exactly what Retha just said. Our day-to-day lives have become more and more partisan, and a lot of it has happened because of the lack of local reporting. A lot of news reporting is very partisan, so people are hearing partisan things all day, and people view things through a partisan lens. Social media has helped that. It's become an echo chamber of partisanship, and people start to look at everything through a partisan lens. And there is no partisan way to govern at the school board. There's no partisan way to pave the roads. These are all nonpartisan issues that I think we all can agree that we want better for our communities. And we just have to keep reminding our board members that these are nonpartisan races and that we expect them to govern in a nonpartisan way.
Connie, I can imagine this is a hot discussion in your political science classes. What's the answer here from a local perspective in terms of this partisan nature of our?
Well, gosh, I could talk about partisanship and polarization, but for context, it's important to realize that many of our local elections, they're nonpartisan for a reason. And the reason dates back to the late 1800s, early 1900s, and the progressive reform movement. There were political machines like Tammany Hall in New York City, the Republican Medill machine in Chicago. Now machines, there's good sides and bad sides. They came into existence because there were really no city services, really no city government at all. And what happened was by the early 1900s, the upper middle classes, business elites in cities realized that they were losing power to the working classes and newly arrived immigrants. So they put forward a whole lot of reforms like off-year elections and nonpartisan elections to weaken the power of the machines. And so that's the reason we have these nonpartisan elections. Now, there's arguments for nonpartisan elections, and there's good arguments as well for partisan elections. So, that's a separate debate, I think, in how we structure our elections from how polarized and partisan we have become as a citizenry. So, if we think just because you have nonpartisan elections doesn't mean that you're going to get nonpartisans.
Right. Well, and because people's worldview is so impacted by their partisanship, at least at this stage, but there are definitely policy issues that are very distinct, and it seems like the lens needs to shift between just looking at it, are you a Democratic or Republican, versus are you science-based? Do you how do you feel about climate change and issues related as opposed to just partisanship? And
importantly, these two factors, off-cycle elections and nonpartisan elections, what we know from political science research is both of those factors contribute to low voter turnout.
Yeah.
So, if you don't have a party label, if you don't have the party or mobilizing people to vote, plus it's an off cycle, these are two key factors that drive low voter turnout to think about. So people have this grand idea sometimes, I think, that nonpartisan elections are good, partisans bad. It's a mixed bag on both sides. Like nobody's getting out in the clear here. But the larger question, which we can dive into, which others have, is just how polarized we become as a society, and this creates real problems.
Yeah, and I think Patrick had mentioned in an earlier question about that, being a partisan and voting in a partisan election is almost allows you to hit the easy button, because you can just say, certainly the lever, when we used to click the levers, that was easy. You could just go on down the line, but it allows you the easy button. You don't have to think about a judge or research a judge because you can see that, to a certain party. So that makes it a little bit more difficult, and maybe that does in fact keep people from voting because there's no easy button for them to push, right?
And
Yeah.
something else I want to hit on with that is,
Mhm.
Connie just mentioned this, although there aren't these machines anymore, there still are partisan organizations. And what we see in the even year elections, we see in the presidential or the gubernatorial elections, are that we do have different sides of the aisle, different party organizations that are spending a lot of money, that have a lot of volunteers that are driving turnout in these elections. And that doesn't exist in these off-year, these local municipal elections. And that drives turnout down because people don't know who's running for these offices. There's no one out there advocating for them. There aren't people that are out there talking about the candidates. I'm sure that we all know that in those even year elections, we know about every candidate. We get lots of calls, we get lots of mail, we get lots of things about them. In these even year elections, we don't get much information about them, and that drives turnout down.
Absolutely. And that actually is you keep giving me these lovely bridges to the next segues to the next question. So thank you. Thank you for that, Patrick. Because we want to talk a little bit about how people get their news these days. And that is definitely related to partisanship. Part of it too is that local papers have struggled and closed. Some of them have been bought up by, let's say a conservative media outlet, and that would maybe potentially create a slant of some sorts. People get their news now from mostly ideologically based news organizations, and of course social media. We've talked a little bit about that, but let's talk a little bit more about how that impacts local elections. In your view, in terms of how people are filtering the topics at hand, or how they're even getting to know the candidates. I don't know, Connie, would you like to start us off here?
Sure. And you're correct. Just over the past 15 years, there have been 2,100 local newspapers in the US that have shut down. More have been downsized, probably even more over the past year with the COVID pandemic. And it's not just print. Just 5 companies own nearly 40% of all broadcast television stations nationwide. And so what we have all throughout the United States are news deserts. Localities with limited or no local news outlets. We're a little better off here in Chicago than other places. For example, last summer, like many people, we got in the car and took a, car trip to a family home that was empty. And we stopped in North Dakota, and literally there was only one station on the television, and that was Fox News. That was it. And these news deserts are bad for our democracy. And so without local news, this leads people not only to go to their 24/7 cable news echo chamber, but they also go to the internet. And too many Americans lack news literacy and can be easily influenced by things like conspiracy theories and disinformation. And that's a real concern, as we've seen play out. Without going into all the details, I mean, just thinking about January 6th, thinking about the rise of QAnon, all of this kind of stuff breeds itself on the internet. And so if we don't have local news, people then turn to the internet. And if they don't have the media literacy to figure out what's opinion, what's fact, what's just a conspiracy theory, all of that is super bad for our democracy.
Right. Retha, your view
Well,
on
Connie, you hit the nail on the head on that one. Social media and Facebook, they are, to me, a villain. When we think about, it's so difficult to really sift through fact or fiction. And even if you give facts, and if it's not in a credible or from their perspective, I mean, it's really hard that I think we've stopped thinking. We've stopped being curious. We don't look for the other side of anything. It's like, well, I just want to hear what I want to hear. And if you make me do that, I'm going to get mad at you. So again, it goes back to that divide that we have. And what's, I was talking with someone or listening to something about, if you have a true press newspaper, they have certain ethics that, they take an oath of what they're doing as a journalist. So, they have a responsibility, and they take that responsibility serious, and when you don't have that, and I haven't heard of the desert that you mentioned, Connie, but that's so true. But we need we need someone there that is not biased, that is just putting the information out there. That's a trustworthy source. And I don't know if anyone would. It depends on who you ask, who their trustworthy source is.
Well, even just getting coverage on things like this event is difficult because there's not a lot of, there's just not a lot of resources from a local perspective if you don't use social. I don't know, Patrick, what's your view on information sources? Again, could be a whole forum in and of itself.
Absolutely. There's so much that we could talk about on this. And I'm very concerned with what I see happening with a lot of local papers. I'm very concerned with a lot of organizations that I'm seeing buy up local papers and turn them into very partisan things that pretend to be news, that spew lots of disinformation overall. I'm also very concerned with confirmation bias. And what I will say is social media is one of the greatest things ever created, and it's also one of the worst things created. Social media feeds into confirmation bias. Oftentimes we wonder, why would people believe that something is true? How could they not know the other sides of this? And the way that social media works is when you click on something, when you like a specific article or type of article, when you like certain people, certain posts that people make, you only start to see things that are similar to that. You don't see things that aren't similar to that. So you may only be seeing a certain type of news story. You may only be getting certain information via social media. And that becomes your worldview when you're seeing that on Facebook, when you're seeing that on Instagram, when you're seeing that on Twitter. And the way the algorithm works is it pushes things out to you that you have liked or that you've interacted with previously.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm just doing a quick little time check here. This has gone so fast already. We're about 5 minutes to 8. And we'd said we'd wrap this up at 8:15. And we haven't even touched on getting to sort of addressing voter apathy. And we've got a bunch of questions too that I see, and some of them are addressing sort of how we can improve turnout in local elections as well. So let's move on to that section. I did have a question about COVID-19 and the impact of the pandemic, but probably people are even tired of talking about that at this stage. So the first question is then, just generally speaking, we've grabbed a few ideas, but what are some solutions for increasing turnout locally? What can we do, I guess, on broader terms to increase turnout? And then what can we do even as individual communities to try to increase turnout? Retha, would you like to start us off here?
When I think about I think, Patrick, you had kind of said a little bit, when we have the big campaigns, we've got people out on the streets, everyone is really pushing the, go vote. And those get out to vote campaigns work, but when you look at the smaller consolidated elections, there's not the budget for it, there's not the people for it, and so we have to really think about forums, whether they're and again, we're still trying to handle the COVID challenges with the mask and social distancing and virtual, but still using virtual as far as opportunities to work with the public forum, whether it's a Zoom opportunity, whether it's local churches, civic clubs, and being able to, what are some other community activities that you might be able to jump into that people are already there. And again, this is going to help us much for this election, I hope, but trying to think about how do we get people together that we can have that message to really understand what's the impact, why is it important, and what is their role in really supporting and their own community and their own education of the students.
Mhm.
So I really think the grassroots efforts is probably the best effort of trying to get it out there, because that's where you can go out to specific communities. And I tell you what, I mean, I think the when I would, in previous work that I've done, you know, I would go to the public housing and I would be in their community centers. I would go to the churches. I mean, there's so many grassroots areas that we could tap into to at least get the word out. If we can find someone to at least, you know, be able to publish or get information out, whether it's a bio or here's the 3 things about me as a candidate. I mean, there's got to be some way of getting that out at the
Yeah.
grassroots level.
So getting back to that sort of community, the basics of community organizing. Patrick, your view on what can we do to get people to wake up?
I couldn't agree more
Mhm.
with what Retha just said, is making sure that we're getting out into all communities and finding centers of influence within the community. So whether it's a person in a particular faith-based institution that has influence, or finding others within community groups and having them maybe come out and have the candidates all come out and speak with them, or telling them about the League of Women Voter candidate forums, and making sure that people tune into those candidate forums, maybe even having people from those parts of the community as moderators or of a part of candidate forums, so that they can get that information out to people within the community. I think that is a great way to get the information out. Also looking at the election cycles themselves and just reminding people that there isn't an election day anymore. I like to call election day the last day to vote. That is the last day that people have to vote, but there's an early vote period. People can vote by mail. There are lots of ways that people can vote. So letting them know that they have a long period to vote. So even if they are busy in their day-to-day lives, they may be busy on that particular Tuesday, they may be working, they may have something going on with their children. There are lots of days that they can vote. So there is an election season, not necessarily one day to vote.
Mhm. Absolutely, absolutely. And Connie.
Yeah, and what Patrick said too, you know, in Illinois, it's not just one election day. Some states still do. There have been throughout our history this long legacy of systemic racism and voter suppression that's made it difficult for some people to access the ballot box. So in all ways, we should be working to make it easier to register to vote. You know, there's hurdles to registering on top of, you know, beyond just showing up on the day and voting. You know, some of the things we can look at are making election day a holiday, increasing early voting, extending it out longer, mail-in voting, more polling locations, making them more convenient. As I think about DuPage County. I live in the city, but I work in Elmhurst and am in DuPage County quite a bit. It's impossible to get around without a car, really. And so thinking about where those polling places are they accessible? Can public transportation take you there? All of those sort of structural things matter. One of the things I think about, you know, just in terms, part of my job is to get, you know, my students to care about politics and government. And Patrick, this might go back to what you were talking about when we were talking about accountability and transparency. You know, local governments have a role to play in this too. They have to give citizens something, you know, to care about. And part of that is to engage their citizenry in meaningful ways. Oftentimes, local government is just in a one-way communication, you know, telling you what they're doing. And in many ways, they could be more participatory. And we've seen this happen with things like participatory budgeting. We've seen it in the wards in Chicago, participatory planning, that it's not just top-down one-way communication that fully engages citizens in critical decisions about land use, about school budgets, social services. All of these things matter. And ultimately, civic education. I wouldn't be worth my, you know, my credentials as an educator if I didn't say civic education. We fought really hard for many years to get civic education back into Illinois K through 12 schools, which just took effect in 2020. And we have to expand that civic education and have it include things like media literacy, all the rest. And citizens aren't born. It has to be modeled for folks. We have to model it. We have to educate citizens. It's not something that just happens automatically. So ultimately, it's up to us to make sure that we're doing our part and holding up our end of the citizenship deal, which has responsibilities.
Mhm, mhm. This is great, and I think we could dive in so deeply on each of these topics, but I also want to make sure we get to some of the questions people are asking. And related to something that was said by a couple of you in terms of when elections are held. There are a couple questions here about elections being held on a Saturday or a weekend, or should it be a holiday always? We had it be a holiday in Illinois for some municipalities, but not across the board. Is there a solution? Tuesdays, what the heck? Can we have it on a day that's convenient for more people? Maybe Connie, you can answer that, since you probably are the history perspective there.
Well, I can tell you we should. The problem is the politics of this, right? Because incumbents benefit from low voter turnout. We know that. Incumbents would be the ones to pass the legislation. And this is something where you do find bipartisan support. Incumbent Democrats and incumbent Republicans, typically, not all, but a large majority don't necessarily want to make it easier to vote. And so this goes back to the role of citizens and accountability and pressuring our elected officials to, do the right thing and enact policies that represent their constituents.
Wow. And make it easier for people to vote, again, so you don't have to take off of work. You don't have to make sure you get a babysitter for your kids or whatever it ends up being. So just ticking off a few of these, one of the questions is about candidates running as a slate, which from a trustee perspective or a school board perspective, what's the view generally? And maybe we'll start with Reith on this one, about candidates locally running as a slate, even if it's nonpartisan.
That's a good question for me, because I can have issues with running as a slate. And when I think about, a team coming on, you're not building a new system. You're going to be coming on, and sometimes when you've got a slate, it can pull a whole board one way or the other. It can bring in partisan, and the political part of it, I think is interesting, and how they do that. And so it has its pros and cons, but I always veer on caution when that's happening, because sometimes is it manipulation? What's the motivation there? And I know that it makes it easier for them to run. Sometimes it's easier for them to vote as a slate, saying, hey, if Reith is good, then Jack and Jeff have got to be good, right? So I struggle with that, and I know that is common practice for some communities, but I sometimes I don't know if it's the best approach of getting the right individual on a specific team.
And also supporting that sort of sometimes the one issue, when you get activists on one issue, bringing in a whole school board slate with one perspective is not helpful. Connie or Patrick, do you have a view on slates, running as a slate locally?
I can definitely.
Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Connie.
No, I was just going to agree with Rita. I don't necessarily think that's good, because you're not getting the diversity of opinion for a deliberative body that's needed in a democracy.
In my perspective, I can understand why candidates do it. It's difficult to get your name out as a candidate, and elections are very, very expensive. If you want to have a chance to get your name out, you're going to have to spend a lot of money to really reach voters at this point. And really the only way that many candidates can do that is by pooling their resources together as a slate.
There was a question here related to that about if a board or a person holding an individual office be assessed on how they are, what kind of outreach they do have, or what their education efforts are. Should that be something that we evaluate with regard to how these candidates or incumbents deserve our vote? Retha?
I don't know if I understand the question. Could you?
Well, the question is, should a board or a person holding an individual office be assessed on their community outreach or education efforts in terms of what they're doing to reach out to different communities?
I would think that they have to put in effort. They have to put the work into it. I don't know if they need to have a resume to become, that makes them an active, I said, hey, I'm going to be a great board member because, hey, I do all this good stuff. I think that it's good for them to share what they do, why they're doing, and it kind of goes to why their motivation, because when you look at the roles of the individuals that are elected for these positions, they're doing it as hopefully as a servant leadership role. And thinking about that. And usually if they're engaged in those type of activities, it kind of shows that they understand collaboration. They understand that sometimes you have to compromise. And so I would think that having some of that in their background as far as who they are, but I don't know if it's a requirement that they have to have certain expectations met.
Patrick, from a NAACP perspective, you obviously have a lot of candidates who are, seeking to talk to your constituency. How do you view that with regard to their outreach?
I view it as a good thing. I think it's really required of candidates overall. If candidates aren't willing to put in the work, if they aren't willing to reach out to different constituencies, they're not going to represent those constituencies. So I think it shows good effort that they're taking the time to reach out to their constituencies. And I would hope to continue that. And that definitely is something that a lot of us monitor, of how, once they are elected, are they continuing to still reach out to the community?
Absolutely. Connie, anything else to add?
No, I would agree. I mean, that's certainly an important factor in how many voters assess their elected officials.
So here's a question that was asked early on. Beside local issues, does voter apathy enable corruption in government? Connie, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, what we know from the political science literature is that when voter turnout is low and there aren't the accountability mechanisms like an election, there are increased opportunities for corruption. Going back to our earlier conversation, what we're finding now too in different studies, it's that there is a strong association between newspaper circulation and corruption. So if you don't have a local newspaper that is covering politics and the elected officials, corruption goes up. So you've got low voter turnout, you've got loss of local papers, all of that are factors that contribute to corruption. I mean, importantly, one of the things that citizens can ask for, and governments in Illinois have been slow to do, is to have ethics reform legislation. So to look at your local government, what is your ethics legislation? What are your ethics rules? If they don't have one, why the heck not? Your county board. This is something that every local government should be able to clearly hand a citizen who asks for it. So in terms of fighting corruption, I mean, that's something really important to take a look for. And when we look at like the city of Chicago, there's an inspector general who looks at issues of corruption. There's no such thing out in DuPage. It just doesn't exist.
Yeah. And probably not a press also to hold accountable with regard to sort of sniffing out corruption.
Yeah. So, I mean, people who track corruption, my co-author on my book, Dick Simpson, does a lot of it. In tracking of corruption, I mean, that's one of the things they're finding, is that when people don't vote, when there isn't a newspaper, when there's not accountability measures and ethics ordinances, and there's no oversight over inspector general, like an inspector general, it just breeds corruption, and it makes it that much more difficult to trace it and to hold elected officials accountable.
Absolutely. We have a question here. If the DuPage NAACP and League of Women Voters, do we endorse certain candidates? And I can answer for the League of Women Voters is that we never endorse candidates. We're always nonpartisan. But Patrick, what is the view on the NAACP?
And that's the same. The NAACP is nonpartisan. We do not endorse candidates.
Okay, good, that's clear. So somebody asked, what is your perspective on CRTL, culturally responsive teaching legislation? Many voters feel it's a partisan issue. What can be said to voters who are concerned that it is partisan? So CRTL, is anybody familiar with that and like to respond? Connie, Patrick, Retha?
Actually, it was on the news tonight.
Oh, it was, okay.
And I was listening to just the Springfield news and the reaction. There's a misunderstanding that, okay, they're putting these new standards out, but they're not for K-12. They're for college level in preparing in teacher courses. And they're trying to address heightening awareness of equity. So I think right now there's a misunderstanding of, okay, well, what are we teaching our kids? It's like, no, it has nothing to do with K-12. It's going up higher. And so they're trying to explain that, and they are trying to have the content so that as a teacher going to classroom, I mean, I am a teacher, I was not prepared for certain things when I went back, when I would walk into a classroom. So they're trying to help educate our future teachers so they can look at equity from that type of lens, and helping them so they do go back in the classroom, they have the skills they need to understand that. That's kind of what I've been hearing, and that's what I heard as far as the explanation of what that is.
Great, okay. Appreciate that. I'm just looking at time, or at 8:12. There's one other question. Does the panel feel that election fatigue following the effort in 2020 and everything that went on with that is also part of the reason we may have some election fatigue, voter apathy going forward?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So do you think that will have an impact on this next election, that there'll be even a lower voter turnout potentially? Anybody care to hazard a guess?
I hope not. I hope they're thinking about what does their community need.
Mm-hmm.
It's no longer about what's going nationwide. And as we said earlier, that local elections have more impact on their daily life. It depends on, it's their local taxes, it's resources they have available to them. It's all of that is so key. So I hope that they could push it inside, that was kind of big picture. What does it look like for my community? And I have a responsibility to my community to think about what's the good of the many, and what do we need to do to accomplish that. So I hope not.
15% is what we did last time. So it's a pretty low bar. So hopefully we can improve on that. And in our remaining minutes, I would like to ask all of you to just one more question. And that is, what can people on this Zoom do to help? We're already here. So we're showing that we're not apathetic towards voter apathy. But what can we do as a League of Women Voters, or just the citizens from the community who are on this webinar? What can we do to help improve voter turnout? And we'll start with Patrick.
So there are lots of things that we can do. Obviously, I would say first and foremost are letting people know about the League of Women Voter candidate forms that are coming up. That's going to be a big way that people can learn who candidates are, and they can make the right decisions in voting. I would also say get involved with nonpartisan voter contact efforts. So if organizations are doing phone banks or other efforts to register voters or to get voters to show up at the polls, get involved in those efforts to contact voters and let them know that there is an election coming up.
Great. Retha?
Yeah, I think sometimes we don't give ourselves enough credit that as an individual, you have influence. Whether you're talking with your family, your friends, or anyone, talking to your friends, hey, they may see names that they don't even recognize, but they said, I think, Retha talked about that person, and so you can have an influence just on those around you. And you might trust somebody's recommendation. Maybe they didn't have the time to do all the research, but being able to talk with someone that can just have the conversation. So I think it's always being open, discussing the importance of it, and just making sure that that any opportunity you have, that you just encourage them. This is important for our community.
That's great. And Connie, I'll give you the last word then.
Well, I agree. In our society, we're too afraid to talk about politics. It's one of those taboo things, right? We should all be talking about politics. It impacts our daily lives. And don't be afraid to talk about politics. Refer people to the League of Women, refer them to the NAACP, refer them to a website that has information about candidates. Importantly, talk to people, that are different than you are. When we're talking about how polarized we are as a country, we've got to start having dialogues with people that we may disagree with, and trying to find common ground. We've become so segregated, not only by race, but by communities, just within communities. We're segregated by income and other factors, and we don't interact with people that are all that different than us. And so, anything, if I would say anything that would help not only voter turnout, but our democracy overall, is for us to start talking to people and trying to understand. And I know that can be difficult in, the bubbles that we live in, but in order for our democracy to survive, we have to have productive dialogue.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much to all three of you for this really wonderful panel. I actually can't wait to go back on and watch the video and watch it again, because as a moderator, I'm trying to juggle a few things, because it just was really enlightening to me and really helpful. And I hope everyone watching feels the same way. So I'll turn it over to Erica and Kristen to close us out.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. It's very lively and engaging discussion. I was fascinated by the panel, and I thank each one of you, Connie, Patrick, and Retha, for joining us and inspiring us with all your ideas. So everyone, have a good evening, and thank you again for joining us.
Thanks, everybody. And we want to pay attention to our screen here and do everything that our panelists just suggested, which is to register for our candidate forums. The links are live, lwvge.org. And many thanks to Karen Daly and her communications team for all this great branding. Be vocal, vote local. Come on board, learn about the candidates, and do your part. Karen, thank you so much for tonight. Thank you, panelists.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Thanks.